This episode is brought to you by Kia's first 3-row all-electric SUV, the Kia EV9, with available all-wheel drive and seating for up to 7 adults, with a 0 to 60 speed that thrills you 1 minute and available reclining lounge seats that unwind you the next. Visit kia.com/EV9 to learn more. Ask your Kia dealer for availability. No system, no matter how advanced, can compensate for all driver error and or driving conditions. Always drive safely.
Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast, your go-to source for personal, professional, and organizational growth and development. We hope you tune in often for all things people management, organizational development and change, organizational leadership, and social impact related. Maximize your personal and organizational potential with Human Capital Innovations Podcast. Welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. In this HCI podcast episode, I talk with Dr. Scott Anderson about working with executive teams to drive successful organizational change initiatives. Scott Anderson, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I'm so excited to have a chance to talk with you today. You're such a fascinating individual with a really interesting professional background, but one of the things I really love about your background specifically is your focus on change management, which is one of my passions and real key interests and drivers in my own career. And so I think it'll be a lot of fun to have the chance to explore change management topics and your experience working with executives to bring about change initiatives within organizations.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's my passion, and I think it's safe to say that when I came across change management as a formal discipline, that I found my tribe, I found my people, and really a lot of purpose and passion in the work that I'm doing. So it's certainly a welcome opportunity to talk with you and have this discussion about change management, about executives, about the importance of change management in any organization.
Wonderful. And as we get started, I want to share a little bit about Scott with the listeners. As a change management and business communication strategist, Scott Anderson helps executives get more buy-in, quicker adoption, and better business results in their major organizational changes. His career has been about helping individuals, teams, and leaders organize and simplify their difficult challenges into actionable plans that improve their results and unchain their potential. He has a whole series of credentials behind change management, and he's led various change management initiatives in the IT industry, including software implementations, enterprise planning, enterprise project management practices, corporate performance measurement and dashboards, technology governance policies and processes, and many other executive initiatives. In addition to change management, he's also experienced in executive communications, business and professional communications, performance management, training development, the IT industry, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on and on and on because you have such a fascinating background. Before we get started, Scott, anything you'd like to add to kind of your background and your framing of the world?
You know, I think it's interesting because I've looked at what is it that makes me. I started out in social work, so I started out as a clinical social worker working with individuals on how they change, and then I've had this interest in technology and kind of all along the way, even in my PhD work, I was focused on persuasion and social influence. And I've kind of looked back and wondered, how did I get to where I am today? Like, what's that common thread? And as I've identified that, it's really about helping organizations and individuals to achieve their potential. And kind of what drives me and what I do is so often I see situations that are a whole lot more difficult than they need to be. Like I just see so much frustration and difficulty and challenges that comes up in organizations, and I just think there's a better way there are ways that you can improve the likelihood that your change efforts will succeed, and it doesn't have to be as painful as it needs to be. If you've gone through any kind of a change in an organization and you personally experience the pain of going through that change, that's essentially what I feel is my responsibility to do, is to help organizations to minimize that pain, to make it easier and to make it a more productive and healthy experience for everybody who's involved in the change. So that's kind of my common thread, is really oftentimes I don't think it has to be as hard as it needs to be, and there are ways to make it a whole lot better. And change management is definitely one of those disciplines that makes a difference in the organizations.
Awesome. And I think that's so cool that you have a social work background before getting into change management and the tech industry and all these different elements. My PhD is in sociology, and so not a social worker, but similar kind of natural kind of leanings and tendencies. And I'm kind of the black sheep in my family, so to speak, because my family are all like therapists and social workers. And then
Gotcha.
I'm the guy that ended up doing it for business.
Gotcha.
But it really is a lot of the same stuff, right? But it's just framed in a different way, and you're still helping individuals and teams and organizations rather than individuals and couples and whatnot.
And I would say it's not only kind of the framing that's different in terms of I don't know, the context and kind of what I'm accomplishing, but I go back and look at my social work foundations in terms of when you start talking about family therapy and looking at systems theory and looking at the interplay of all these different pieces that come together to make a change really work. It's never just one person or one piece of the system. It's that system within the context, or it's that one piece within the context, and it's the interaction and the interplay. And it gets really fascinating when you start looking at that, not only individually, but then in small groups or within a family setting or on teams or in teams, or taking it out to a large organization. It's still some of those same principles that I learned in that social work background that still guide my thinking and the way I'm seeing the world around me as I approach change and change management. I can't see change management and any kind of change as being just dictated from the top down. That just doesn't, unless the system would allow it, unless the system is set up that is the way the interaction should be. But to me, it's always this interplay of all these forces and factors and learned interactions, and it's that whole environment, that whole context that becomes really fascinating when you're talking about any kind of change, and how do we start working with kind of the components of that to get everybody working together, moving towards the same direction.
Yeah. So you've already started to talk about it a little bit, some of the key elements that need to be there for change to be successful. But if you're going into an organization and you're talking with an executive and there's this big change initiative coming down the pipeline, I mean, most people, it's human nature for people to be resistant to change for a variety of reasons. And so you might be facing resistance from the executive team themselves, but certainly there's going to be resistance at some stage, with people in the organization. So how do you talk through resistance to change and successful setup and implementation of the change initiative with the executives as you're starting things out, so you can drive success of the initiative?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question, and I think that the answer is almost embedded in the question, because just the fact that you're talking with the executive, there's been a lot of research, and like I come from a background that's associated with Prosci, and Prosci is a company that's been around for about 20 years, and they've done about 10 longitudinal studies at this point, looking at how organizations go through change. One of the consistent findings that they've had is that the number one contributing factor to whether or not a change will succeed is active and visible sponsorship. And then it's actually interesting because executive sponsors, are on what we would call kind of the naughty and the nice list. So they're on the side of when things succeed, the number one factor was that you had that sponsor who was active and visible. But also when people are asked about projects that failed, that didn't succeed or didn't achieve what they intended, and then they're asked why, the number one reason is we didn't have that active and visible sponsor. So I think that's the very first place it's got to start. Just even having that access to that executive sponsor who's going to care enough about it to get behind it and make whatever the change is work. You've got to have that. That is absolutely critical, and it's critical enough that for me in my own personal interaction, that's the very first question that I'll ask is, who is it that's behind this? Who is it that's really pushing for this change to happen? And if I can't identify a clear sponsor, I'm usually pretty cautious about engaging, because I know that it's just that big enough of a success factor that if it's not in play, and if you don't have that sponsor in place, the likelihood of your success just went down tremendously. It opens the doors to some uphill battles that I personally don't want to have to fight. So I think that's the very first thing that we've got to do is get in and teach these executives what their responsibilities are in leading change, to realize that they're really the ones who are setting the tone. And what I find with a lot of executives is their initial response to change management is that they're a little hesitant to buy into it, that they look at it and say, well, that's one of those soft skills, I'll reach out to the communications people to take care of that, or can the training team take care of that? Once they start diving in to really understand what change management is, my experience has been that it usually doesn't take more than maybe an hour or 2 hours of conversation to get them bought in. And the key there is once they understand that change management it's not about what I do and it's not about what I do, it's about what I deliver. And what I deliver as a change manager is results and ROI for whatever project it is that the sponsor is trying to push forward, whatever the change is. So I'll often go back to this idea of helping a sponsor to understand, why does change management matter? And the way that I think about it is I conceptualize it as a big circle. And if you take that circle and then say, okay, all of the benefits that we hope to get from this initiative, this change, this project, whatever it is, let's just imagine that all of those benefits are inside that circle. Now, with that being the case, and this is kind of the magic question that I like to ask is, what percentage of those benefits depends on people changing how they work? So once I ask that question, oftentimes executives, managers, people across the board will come back and they'll say, it's usually like 70%, 80%, 90%. You can have the best system, you can have the best technically correct solution to a problem, but if nobody uses it, it's not going to provide you anything. You're not going to get the ROI that you want. So that's where I bring it back to that question and say, okay, so how much of it, what percentage of all that success actually depends on people changing how they work? And then once I ask that question, I think it really opens people's eyes to say, wow, it really is a large portion that's dependent on people getting on board with the change. It's dependent on bringing people along and helping them to be successful in making the transitions that they need to for that change in the end to be successful. Usually, as a little side note, it's always fun with that exercise to go ahead and draw a line through that circle that would indicate about where the 80% is or the 70%, and then just to rhetorically ask, so where do we spend most of our time and resources? Because oftentimes they'll come back and they'll point at the remaining 20% or 15%, and it just highlights the inequity oftentimes in where we really spend our resources. So I'm a huge advocate of saying we have got to get the people on board. And the reason we do it is because I want to achieve the ROI on this project. I am business driven and business results and outcomes focused. And I know that the way that you accomplish that is you get the people on board with the change. And that's how we make a real difference to the organization, to the bottom line, whether it's a mission driven organization or whether they're driven by a financial ROI. It's the same thing. You do it by bringing the people along in the changes with you.
Yeah, I really love that. Creating buy-in across the layers of an organization with a champion, with an executive champion, or ideally even the whole C-suite team to drive the change. That's so vital. It's not easy to do, but if you take the initial steps, if you lay the groundwork and the foundation for it, it takes some effort up front, but it'll pay huge dividends down the road. I'm sure you probably have some examples earlier in your career where things didn't go quite the way you'd hoped. I know I've had those types of examples too. And almost always when I look at some of the, I think of one in particular that happened when I was consulting with an organization maybe 15 years ago. And I thought things were going great. And then like it just completely imploded, like overnight almost. And I was shocked. I was surprised. And it came down to exactly this. I thought I had more executive support than I had. I'd taken it for granted. I didn't continue to have those discussions. There were key people within the executive team that not only didn't support it, but actively opposed it that I wasn't aware of, And so all of those things will undo anything that you're trying to do. And it takes a real consistent, sustained effort over a long period of time to have change initiatives stick. And so you can't do what I did 15 years ago and take it for granted. I've been working with this organization for 1.5 years. I thought we were like on a good path, but it all imploded, just literally overnight almost.
And I think that story really highlights how common it is. I mean, that story is a common experience in a lot of organizations. You're saying your story, and I've got a story that's almost parallel, knowing that it was 2 years of effort, of a lot of resources spent looking at replacing a key system. And all the project team came in to the CEO for kind of the final, what was supposed to be the rubber stamp approval of the new vendor that they'd be moving forward with. And after they'd got their final slide up and said, so we've selected the vendor, the CEO asked one question and said, so how well will this work with our partners? And immediately I could feel that this thing started just rumbling and the bolts started popping off. And people started saying, well, yeah, I was concerned about that from the beginning, and that's why I wanted to go with another vendor. And really within about 8 seconds, 2 years of work was just completely undermined. And it goes back to that same thing, that we didn't bring the CEO along. We didn't bring along that key executive and have that alignment among that C-suite on some of the basics. There are some things that organizations can do to start positioning their projects for success. And one of those things that they need to do right from the beginning is to establish some of the basics. And I look at those basics as being able to answer the questions of like, why are we doing this change? Why are we doing it now? One of the key elements is also, what is the risk of not making this change? But I find that sometimes in working with executives, they have a vision for the future, and it's a vision that gets a little fuzzy around the edges. And so as a change manager, I feel like my job is to come in and to help them start crystallizing defining a little bit more what that vision is, by encouraging them to come up with some of those really concrete talking points to say, why are we doing this? And again, why now? What's the risk of not changing? What's going to happen to the organization if we don't make this change? So I think that it's the executive leaders who have a real responsibility to ensure that they're setting their project up for success from the beginning by driving some of these key high-level questions of what is the whole purpose of this particular change? within our strategy and kind of that big high level, big picture thinking stuff that they're really well positioned to bring to the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as I consider, again, the good and bad examples from my own experience, as well as reading about, cases and reading articles about, how to do it effectively, or some of the things that you might do inadvertently to sabotage, a change initiative. It really does often come back to establishing the why, having a clear vision and purpose behind the initiative, because that is what will resonate in communicating the why and the ROI back to the executives. That's what they're most interested in. They want to know, how is this going to help us do our work better? How is this going to help the organization serve our customers better? All of those things are the types of the questions. And sometimes we think, well, this is just a better process. Like this will just make people's lives easier. And that may be an interesting why to us, or maybe we do see a process problem where we see, some issue. But the disruption caused by the change initiative and the fact that, 75, 80% of change initiatives fail, it makes leaders question, is it actually worth it? Is the marginal increase in productivity due to some new process worth all of the disruption, all of the angst, all of the resistance, all of the, all the stuff that goes along with the change initiative? And if often it does, but we need to be able to speak that language to them. We need to be able to share that ROI with them and help them understand why and how this new thing that we're doing, this new process, this new approach, this shift in our employee engagement strategy and our customer loyalty strategy, like the way we do these things, this is going to enhance the bottom line, and this is how. That's what we need to be able to do and communicate. Yeah. And that's, I think, often what we miss when we're trying to go about these initiatives.
Yeah, and it's interesting. If you look at the, again, going back to some of this research from Prosci, they've gone out and asked the question of why is it that employees resist change in an organization? And the number one reason that comes back, the top of that list, is because employees lack awareness of the understanding of why we need to make this change. So that is the number one reason that employees are not getting on board with the change. That's the number one reason that they're resisting change, is because nobody ever sat down and explained to them, this is why we're doing this. This is why this matters, and this is the business need that we have that's driving this. Now I know with that there seems to be that starts entering into the realm of how comfortable a company is being transparent with what's going on. So you may have a super, what Cotter calls this urgency. The very first step in making any kind of a change is you've got to establish this sense of urgency. There may be some organizations that in the background, they're looking at their financials and recognizing that they're going to be in dire straits shortly. And they may not have the cultural values where they want to share that with everybody and say, you know what, this is what's going on. Here are our financials. They may not want to disclose that. And then they just keep going down the line without sharing that, and then it hits that all of a sudden they're no longer an organization that can continue to function, but they didn't bring their people along, and then all of a sudden the change seems sudden, abrupt, people are let go, and it was a surprise. The people had no idea where it came from. Other organizations have this kind of more open approach where they don't mind just sharing what the financials are. They don't mind saying, okay, organization, here's where we are. COVID-19 has brought some changes in organizations. You look at the pandemic and what that's done, and a lot of organizations have had to really look hard at themselves and processes and say, how are we going to do this? We're taking a financial hit. The question that I have is, are they letting their organization understand that? And that's a very compelling why. That establishes a sense of urgency. If you go and say, you know what, honestly, we've had a drop in revenue, and we as leaders, we don't have all the answers. We are in uncharted waters. We're in unprecedented times. We are trying to do the best with what we've got, and there's nobody better positioned than these executives to be trying to figure it out, but we don't have the answers. So I think if there's even that level of transparency of trying to help people understand why are we making these changes, that's one of the first steps in bringing the entire organization along and overcoming that initial resistance that employees might have to a change that's coming.
Yeah.
So I'm an advocate of transparency, especially when it's genuine, and it will drive that urgency to say we've got to make a change.
Yeah, I agree. My bias is definitely towards transparency and over communication as the default.
Yes.
And that will help you drive the why behind whatever you're doing to employees across the organization, which is so key. Maybe in our last few minutes, we can talk a little bit more about kind of the stages that organizations go through in the maturity cycle. You have new startups, they might grow, they go through an initial period of growth, but then sometimes they'll just hit the runway and they'll just take off and have some pretty huge growth over a short period of time. I once worked with an organization that was a family-run business for the first 50 years of its existence, and then all of a sudden it decided to expand, and they brought in investors, and they went to a national model very quickly, and they grew from like 200 employees to 5,000 employees in just a few years. So when you have that kind of an environment, you're going through these stages of organizational growth and maturity. It causes its own set of challenges when you are a change agent trying to drive these change initiatives. Any thoughts on that, how you might approach a small startup differently than a kind of a medium-sized business or a rapidly scaling business or a more mature organization?
Yeah, I love that question, and I love it because it speaks actually to my experience with organizations that I've worked with, and also with where I am currently. So it is interesting that when you've got that startup mentality, a lot of it tends to be about what can we do to immediately meet the customer needs. Like what's the quickest thing that once we hear they need something, let's turn around and get something out the door really quick to meet that need as quickly as possible. It's really common then as you start kind of expanding and growing that you start seeing that those practices just aren't sustainable. And they're not sustainable on a couple of fronts. One of those fronts is that you start duplicating on the back end some of the solutions. So I'm thinking of one organization where it's a situation where we have people who are serving so many different customers. And let's say, for example, they were looking for, in the IT space, they were looking for an application that could help them with their calendaring. And so one person says, great, let's build a calendaring app. And then somebody else in another space builds another calendaring app, and somebody else builds another one. And then internally, you end up with 9 or 10 different calendaring apps that really could be doing the same thing. But they could be consolidating on the back end, but instead they're accruing this technical debt. So you just see that just over time, there's a natural push that says we have to start consolidating. We have to start bringing a lot of these processes together. We have to start putting in some standards and standardizing. And that to me is really where change management kicks in. The change management in a small organization, given that it's a small organization, you're going to be a little more nimble and a little quicker to be able to move around. But as you start expanding to hundreds of people and then thousands of people, you want to still retain that organizational agility, but the skill that it takes in terms of the resources and the ability to do that, the scale is much larger when all of a sudden you're talking about thousands of people that you need to be able to turn on a dime, as compared to if you got 20 people in a corporation. That becomes one meeting to get everybody on board if it's the 20 people organization. But if it's a 20,000 people organization, that all of a sudden goes back to this systems approach, where you've got to have all the different parts that are ready to go that understand their function. So it's teaching the executives what they need to do in change. It's teaching the mid-level managers and supervisors what their role is in change. It's teaching the frontline employees what their role is in change. So it's that would be probably the biggest transition that I see in looking at kind of a smaller organization. The change efforts are going to be a little more manageable because you can have that high level of communication among the group. As you start moving to more of an enterprise change management discipline, then it becomes looking at that more holistic system and talking about what can we do to start equipping each of these areas of the system to be successful in what they need to do for the entire thing to work together. So I don't know if that directly addresses what you were saying, but it's other than saying it's the scale, the magnitude, it really is different as you're moving. There are a lot of growing pains that are associated with going from a small startup to a large sustainable organization. And I believe that change management is one of those things that if somebody can get along okay as a smaller organization without it, it becomes even more crucial and critical the larger the organization gets to be able to make sure that you can get everybody moving in the same direction and develop that agility to respond to whatever the environment is bringing.
Wonderful. I love that answer. I really love the entire discussion today. We're about out of time, which is unfortunate because I would love to continue this, and perhaps we can continue the discussion and explore these topics further on a future episode. But before we close today, I want to give you a chance to share with the listeners how they can get connected with you and how they can learn more about what you're doing in your work. Would you mind sharing just a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'd love to do that. Yeah. First, I would say, by all means, look me up on LinkedIn. Sorry, I apologize. I've got one of my kids in the background there. I'd say look me up on LinkedIn. It's Scott Anderson. I'm currently with Western Governors University. Feel free to connect with me there. And I would love to have any of these other conversations to kind of move things forward. I'm passionate about change management, enterprise change management. There are so many components that go into it. So I would certainly welcome the chance to talk further and welcome connecting with others.
Wonderful. And I know what it's like. I have lots of kids around my house too. It's just the way it is right now. But those are happy noises. So
yes, they are.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you. I encourage listeners to reach out to Scott. Truly a great background and experience, and I think there's lots we can learn from each other as we try to help organizations become more successful. So thanks, Scott. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Likewise. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Human Capital Innovations Podcast. I hope you stay healthy and safe and that you have a great week. Check out our new weekly LinkedIn newsletter, Alchemizing Human Capital, exploring industry trends via original research and interviews with executives and thought leaders from across the globe. We look forward to having you join us.